Look, it's a challenging and very interesting topic you've given me to talk about tonight, and that's about really Australia and how we perceive Asia at this time. It's particularly interesting because we see Asia as being in a state of rapid change, and we are unsure in our own country whether we are managing that change well, or whether we need to shift our policies, change our policies to accommodate the changes in Asia. The changes in Asia are really quite dramatic, and particularly in this day of rapid communication, when you have, as you have in Argentina, a very good foreign service, you're well aware of those changes. If I could just give you some illustration, I think you know this. What is happening in China is really quite dramatic. In 1982, the GDP of China was 9% of the United States. By 2011, it was 50%. By 2016, it is likely to be 4/5 of the GDP of the United States. And by 2020, the GDP could surpass that of the United States. Now, I don't want to suggest that that necessarily means that China is going to surpass the United States in every way. That's not true. Per capita income in the United States will still be significantly larger. The United States will have a military capacity which goes way beyond that of China. Bear in mind that the United States military capacity is far in excess of the next 10 countries after it in this day and age. And that includes not only the cost and value of its military equipment and deployments, but the extent of its technology, not only nuclear technology, but particularly the extent of its battle-fighting technology on the ground or at sea. It is hugely ahead of everybody else. So it would be a mistake to think that merely because China's GDP passes that of the United States in 10 years, and then things can happen which will alter that estimate. But it would be, even if it were true, one shouldn't assume automatically that it means China is more powerful. It has huge problems that it still has to deal with, which the United States in its own way has dealt with decades ago. The second point, I think, is that not only is China and the rise of China dominating our thinking, and it's been dominating our thinking really for the last decade or so, the way in which other countries are changing in the region, partly in response to the rise of China, but partly because of factors internal to themselves, is having a profound effect on what is happening in our immediate environment. Now, let's look at India. India went through major economic reforms at the beginning of the 90s, went through another set of reforms at the beginning of this century. Now, the effect of some of those reforms is currently faltering, but nonetheless, it is still an economy that is growing, if not at 8.5% or 9%, it's still growing at roughly 6.5%, and going through, although it's going through, and it is going through a bad patch right now. But India's GDP is roughly 1/3 that of China. You sometimes hear the view that India at some stage will surpass China. I really don't see that as happening, short of major calamity, and I'll get that in China, which I'll come back to. I think there is much less discussion now of that possibly occurring than there was 4 or 5 years ago. And it's interesting that spending time in both India and China, the Indians talk about it a bit. You never hear it mentioned in China. It's really just not on the table as far as they're concerned. They're ahead and they're moving on. Absolutely no doubt about it. You have in Japan an interesting situation. Once the wealthiest country in the world, and if you were in Washington in the late 80s, as I was, there was even then a view that in terms of GDP, Japan could surpass the United States. That was at the time that the Americans were putting their trade bill through the Congress, when there was a horror of what might happen in Japan. That was the time when Japanese radios were being smashed on Capitol Hill, and when there was a real view that if America was not careful, Japan could become the dominant world power. Well, that just didn't happen. And it didn't happen for a number of reasons, including the strength of the bubble as it was in Japan, the rapid decline of the Japanese economy, or the slowdown and stalemate that occurred in the Japanese economy from the mid-90s onwards. Look also at the political languor that exists in Japan, the lack of initiative, and the problems that have beset the economy, such as have occurred through the tsunami. And Japan doesn't look in very good shape. But it's still a very, very important economy. It's been overtaken by China, but it is still a major economy. I think the issue that you have to think about most, however, with Japan is the fact that its population is now in quite rapid decline. When I was in Japan a few years ago, the population was in the region of 127 million. Now it is already declining, and by 2050 it could have declined to something like 1 million. And what has also occurred some years back, some 20 years back, is that the proportion of Japanese out of the working bracket in comparison with those working has changed dramatically. For example, 3 or 4 years ago, there were something like 4.5 Japanese in the workforce to every Japanese dependent, every Japanese senior. The situation in 2050 will be that there are something like 2.5 Japanese in the workforce, 2.5 Japanese in the workforce to 1 Japanese who is a senior, putting enormous stress on the ability of the country to keep people alive in a reasonably healthy way. So that population factor really, I think, does have to be taken into account in trying to work out the future of Japan. India, I want to come back to. India, fascinating country. Enormous problems in 2 areas, 2 main areas, and a number of other small ones, in relation to its economic development. The first is education, because illiteracy is still around the 65, is still around the 30 to 35% mark for men and 40 to 45% mark for women. That's illiteracy. Take into account also that although a number of people, quite a large number of people, actually attend some form of tertiary education in India, the standard of that education outside the famous Indian Institutes of Technology and a few other universities is not high, nor is the standard of public primary or secondary education high. The figures are absolutely appalling for teacher absenteeism in primary state schools. It is something like 1 in 2 all the time are away from their jobs. To give you some idea of the problems in India. The second problem, which I think they're moving to address as quickly as they can, is the chronic infrastructure in the country. Although airports have improved, although ports have improved, there are still major problems on their railway system in terms of the requirement for new capital, and there are major problems on their roads. India, the last time I looked at it, was spending something like 1/12 of what the Chinese are spending on infrastructure. And the problems of foreign direct investment on infrastructure in India far exceed the problems in China if you are a direct investor. It's not that easy in China, but statistics show that you can get up and going in an investment in an infrastructure program in China in something like half the time, 40% of the time that you can do it in India. The Indian bureaucracy is actually quite horrifying to deal with. For a people that are naturally entrepreneurial, naturally looking for opportunity, the system itself is stultifying. But I always, on these issues, come back to the question of demography. The average age of the Indian population is about 26 or 27. And they face none of the problems that are faced by Japan overwhelmingly, China to an increasing extent, as well as other countries of Asia, in relation to the proportion of the population of working age compared with the proportion of the population who are dependents. Whereas the time when that proportion began to change in favour of dependents in Japan is long past, 20 or 30 years, when the shift began to occur. And it is already past in China, thanks in part to the one-child policy. It's well past. It is not going to start changing in India for another 30 years. So that gives the Indians a huge natural advantage over China, and that is because they will have more people in the workforce of the right age when China is already shrinking. Now, this is only going to be useful if you can feed those people, if you can educate those people, and you can find jobs for those people. And that is the big challenge facing India. And it is not a challenge of anything like the same proportion in China, and it really isn't really a challenge at all in Japan. Okay. So, that's essentially the picture. What you're seeing in Asia is not just the rise of China. You're seeing other dynamics changing, principally India and Japan. But let me come back just for a moment to what is happening elsewhere. In ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which comprises 10 countries, their proportion as a... Sorry, this is half the interpreters too. The degree to which their GDP is climbing up in terms of global GDP has increased by 50% in the last 6 years. And I draw particular attention to what is happening in Indonesia. whereas they have by no means have a perfect system. They crossed the Rubicon from a totalitarian state to a democracy in 1999. They've overcome some quite considerable problems of governance since then, although there are many more that they have to overcome. And the estimate is that by 2030, they could be the 10th biggest economy in the world. And by 2050, they even have some prospect of becoming the 6th biggest economy in the world. Now, what that means is, if it doesn't need any reinforcement, that the fulcrum of economic and political activity has shifted decisively from what you might call the Atlantic region to the Asia-Pacific region. It probably occurred at the beginning of the century, roughly. It's indisputable. And people who have been living in the region have been well aware of that for 2 or 3 decades, really since the 80s. But I recall from the time I was in Japan, this was, the time after all of 9/11, the intervention in Iraq, Afghanistan. If you were living in the United States, all the talk was about terrorism and the ramifications of terrorism for American foreign policy. The enormous impact of the Iraq War and the still very significant impact of the Afghanistan war. If you were sitting in Tokyo, you would be saying, well, this is all very important, but the big game is not Iraq, it's not the Middle East, it's not terrorism. That will change things. But what is causing irreversible and major global change is the rise of China. And that's been around for 10 years. Now, how do we deal with that in Australia? The answer is not as smartly or as well as we should be. And because of that, we are making a major review of our policy towards Asia right now. The government will put out what is known in our system as a white paper in the second half of the year, and that's already been drafted by a group of officials. Interestingly, predominantly with Treasury background, because economics is going to play a very significant part in it. I want to get to security in a minute. Australia is, despite all our fast talking, is not as expert and is not as good on Asia as we like to think we are. We like to sort of strut around with our chests out saying how good we are on Asia. We're not. If you look at the proportion of Australians studying 3 difficult languages in the 70s, that's Chinese, Japanese, and Indonesian, that number has dropped dramatically by now. Indeed, the people who principally do well in Chinese, which is the only Asian language where there has been some increase, are people of Chinese descent who have immigrated to Australia. So they speak Chinese at home, and they do Chinese because they can get first-class honours in it. So it kind of, defeats the purpose. And what it means is that sort of Australians who are not of Chinese origin don't think that studying Chinese is an area where they're going to excel, so they don't do it. Now, it's just an example, but what has happened is study of languages has dropped off in the last generation. It hasn't improved. The study in our universities of Asian studies has declined dramatically in the last 30 years. The expertise on Indonesia, where in the 70s and 80s we were second to none, has diminished considerably. Expertise on India dried up. Most of the faculties on Indian studies have closed in Australia. Japanese diminished dramatically. And let alone studies of Vietnam, Thailand, and so on, all gone. We have to do something about that. And we also have to look very, very closely at how our economies are doing, how our economy is doing in relation to Asian countries. Right now, we like to sort of portray ourselves as the clever country, skilled in all things, and we're actually pretty good. But if you look at the foundation of our diplomatic relations with Japan, China, South Korea, and now with India, it is based principally on one thing, and that is sale of resources. We, like perhaps to a slightly lesser extent than the Canadians, are dependent on our resources for our wealth. And you know, while we do pretty well on education, in fact very well on education, very well on tourism, on all these areas, if we weren't selling coal, gold, iron ore, and natural gas into these markets, not only would our economy be in tatters, but the strong relations that we have with Japan, China, South Korea, and increasingly with India, just will not be in anything like the same shape. It is resources that has enabled us to build our relationship with those countries, and it is resources that is basically keeping our economy in much better shape than other OECD economies. Despite the comment and the sort of, we like to call it whinging in Australia, an expression which really sums up incessant complaint. Despite incessant complaint from those in the Australian community about how tough things are, actually, we're doing very, very well. Now, what we have to do is look at what happens when the demand for our resources begins to decline for one or another reason. Or what happens when the prices change? What happens when it's a new world in 14, 15 years? Now, our view is that the demand from China and India will continue, that there will not be a rapid change in the resources boom. But we have to get cleverer than that. And I think what this report, which is being undertaken by a group of officials led by the former Secretary of the Treasury, is really looking at is the degree to which we can change and fine-tune our economy to improve manufacturing, services, and to diminish an over-reliance on resources. Because we have to change that. We have to be broader. And that's crucial. Okay. So that's roughly how we look at what is actually happening in Asia. How are we accommodating our policies to that change? I think there are probably two or three things that I need to point to. The necessary shifts that we will have to make in the way we manage our economy, and I've referred to that as, I think, dependent on a process that will begin with this white paper. The white paper will by no means be the only issue, but it will begin with the white paper. The second point, I think, is that we have to get right how we handle security in the Asia Pacific, in the Pacific Ocean, and to a lesser extent in the Indian Ocean. What is happening is highly complex, highly difficult, and actually highly debated within the Australian community. Let me just point to a few facts. We, the Australian people, the Australian population, believe that the alliance with the United States is in our best interests. Nothing will change that. It is a deeply held view within the Australian community that we require that relationship. The second deeply held view is that it is in our interests that the United States retain a major strategic security presence in the Pacific and indeed in the Indian Ocean. But we're talking principally about the Pacific. Here, you're not only talking about United States military deployments from Honolulu to Guam into Okinawa in Japan, but the relationship with Japan itself, which remains, I think, crucial to our strategic outlook. The question that arises in some of our minds, however, is this. Nobody doubts that we have to pay our alliance dues to the United States. At least nobody in the foreign policy community really doubts that. Some would, but not too many would. That explains our involvement in Vietnam. It explains our involvement in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Our involvement in Vietnam certainly was not necessarily held by an across-the-board belief in the Australian community that what was happening in Vietnam was a direct threat to our security. Some people thought that. But I think the realists thought, well, it could be right, it could be wrong. A lot of people thought it was wrong. Nonetheless, it was alliance dues that forced us to put alliance dues that were instrumental in our going into Vietnam. Same thing with Iraq, same with Afghanistan. Though with Afghanistan there was a slightly broader view that this was part of an international anti-terrorist endeavour, which not only involved the Americans, but a lot of other people as well, who weren't necessarily, who were allies of the United States because of NATO. So that's, a little bit different to the other two, I think. But this is alliance dues. The question that we're increasingly asking ourselves in some parts of the community is, when we talk about paying alliance dues, that's fine, but do we really need to go further than that? For example, there was a decision made by the governments of Australia and the United States last year that Marines should be deployed in Darwin, about 2,500. Darwin is the city right to our north. Now, that's happened rather quickly. Several questions were asked in the Australian community by conservatives, and even including a former Conservative Prime Minister and his main advisor, and by a number of people who were by no means to the left. The question arose, is this really necessary? Is it necessary first to retain an American presence in the region? Don't know. I would think highly unlikely. The Americans are very good at looking after their own interests, and they would retain a presence in the region for whatever purpose. But it would relate to the United States' interests, not particularly to ours. And secondly, if you deploy Marines in Darwin, is that really necessary when the main threat to global peace, even taking into account peaceful rise in China, where there are enough tensions extant to cause global hostilities? It's actually to the north, it's not down where we are. It's essentially the Korean Peninsula and its surrounds and the South China Sea. It's not Australia and Indonesia. And there is quite major deployment of Marines in that area and other major American assets. So that's a big question. The other big question is, what should we be doing about China? Do we go all the way with the American administration, which is talking, as you will have read, of the famous pivot? That is to say, a redeployment of some American forces from the European theatre, essentially, to the Asian theatre. And a greater emphasis on what is happening in Asia and the Pacific than in managing Europe, looking after what's happening in Europe. And those who debate this say, well, look, it goes from right, the extreme. We have to, they won't say this publicly, but they say, we have to contain China. They won't use the word contain, but that's what it comes down to. We're afraid of China. It's a different system to ours. It looks as if it can dominate the region. We don't like that. It's worrying. We need the Americans here. We should really go all the way with the Americans. Then there is another view that, yes, we want to keep the Americans in the region, but we don't necessarily agree with everything that they are doing in the region. region, and where we disagree, we should make it clear without necessarily doing it publicly that we disagree. Because I think it's important for a number of reasons in our dealings with the region that we be seen to have a genuinely independent voice, and I fear that by many in the region we are not seen in that light. So that also has to be managed. But thirdly, you have to really ensure that the Chinese do behave, don't get extravagant in their military actions, behave in the South China Sea, don't threaten the Philippines and Vietnam. I mean, Chinese get pretty tough, great powers get tough, and you know, it's not in our interests that they dominate the region. There are those, of course, that say that it's not the way the Chinese work. The Sinologists say that, so they're interested in being accorded respect, but they don't want everybody necessarily to be paying them tributary relations in this day and age. Well, it's a debate. But what it comes down to is how do you handle China? How do you manage China? Well, the Americans are reinforcing. They're reinforcing with India. One should not underestimate the strategic importance of what is known as the 1-2-3 agreement, or the nuclear agreement between the United States and India some 4 years ago, roughly. It is overwhelmingly important for a number of reasons, not so much because of the nuclear question that it raised, but although that has some significance, but because it showed a totally new direction in American policy towards India and Indian policy towards America. And that has to do with China, quite clearly. It should not also be ignored that from about 9 or 10 years back, say about, it would have been about 2002 to 2003, the Japanese have been making, who already of course have a major, the major alliance with the United States, as you would know, but the Japanese themselves are making overtures to India, and they now have a security agreement, different from a treaty, quite different from a treaty, but a security agreement with India. And indeed we have a security agreement with India. To tell you the truth, it's not an agreement with a lot of teeth in it, but it is an agreement. And the Japanese agreement with India has a few more teeth in it, but not too much. Neither are countries that like to be openly bellicose or confrontational. Nonetheless, these agreements, they say something. And what I think they're essentially saying is, look, China, we don't want to confront you, we want to engage you. After all, our economies depend hugely on you. The dependence of the Japanese economy on China is just overwhelming. I think it is the second, if it's not the major bilateral economic relationship in the world, it's the second greatest bilateral economic relationship in the world. So, but what they're saying is, look, we want to engage you, we don't want to confront you, but, please don't push us too far. So what you're really seeing in the region is this shuffling between the major powers, trying to find out, where their position really is, not wanting to confront China, but at the same time, not wanting to find themselves dominated by China. They all basically want the United States to stay there, but the ones, who really want the United States most in Asia are the Indians, the Vietnamese, and the Indonesians, as well as, of course, the Australians. Other countries, to a lesser extent, however, are also more comfortable with the United States' presence. But the debate really comes down to, are you having the United States there as an equal partner to the rising China, i.e. as a partner which is still major and significant in the region, but has lost its primacy? Or are you looking for a country which retains security primacy in the area despite the economic rise of China? And I don't think there's an answer in Australia yet. I think you would probably find, if you tapped the majority of Australians underneath it all, they would say, oh, we want American primacy. it would be more the people who think in security terms, more or less as a job, who would say, okay, we really want the United States there, but you know, we want them as, we're prepared to accept them as equals to China, more or less. The tough question, of course, is what happens if arrangements or what is happening in the region deteriorates to the extent that there is a real possibility of hostilities between the United States and China. That's where things get really problematical, because there wouldn't be any automaticity in the perspective of Australians that they want to get into a fight with the Chinese. And there, the question of alliance dues would become very, very, very much an issue. And that's a debate in Australia right now. It's not an open debate. Australians are far more interested in whether they can buy a second car, the cost of a mortgage on their house, whether the cost of a cappuccino is $3.5 or $4. They're far more concerned about these issues. But nonetheless, deep down, I don't want to suggest that Australians are ignorant, any more ignorant than any other sort of global population or major population of the country. But it's just not a priority, and won't be a priority until they really have to think about it. But it's an issue, and it's a big issue that we're looking at. So what I'd like to say to you, leave you with a thought, is really this. The region's changing very fast, and I think probably we have a greater appreciation of that than most. And we've probably got a greater appreciation of the degrees of change, how India is changing, China is changing, Japan is changing, Indonesia is changing, and how all those interrelate. But it doesn't mean to say we've sorted out in our minds how we deal with that group of countries economically, totally, although we're in favour generally of free trade, or in terms of security. One thing I can say with some assurance, certainly in my lifetime, you're not going to see a change in the way Australians regard the importance of keeping the United States in the region, the importance of the United States as an ally. But how you accommodate that alongside with the rise of China and the changes in India and Japan, we still haven't sorted out. I don't think we've really sorted out the economic challenges and, above all, opportunities that are being posed by the rise of China, the changes in Japan, the rise of India, the rise of Indonesia. Let me give you, however, just one sort of thought. This is on this white paper. This is already been said publicly, and it's on websites, so I'm not being indiscreet. The concentration, at least on an official level, of this white paper will be Australia's relations with 6 countries which we believe hold the answers in Asia. And 4 of them are obvious. The obvious one, first of all, is China and India. Thirdly, it's Japan. Fourthly, perhaps a little less obvious, is South Korea. The other 2 are Indonesia, and the 6th, which might surprise you a little bit, is Vietnam. There is, obviously, you can't say that Thailand and the Philippines are not important, and we'll be looking at ASEAN as a whole as very much a target area for our concentration. But those are the 6 countries which we see our bilateral relationships perhaps concentrating most in coming years. Now, in that period of change, I want to make one final point from an Australian perspective. The way I've been talking, and that's because the subject matter of the talk is that we're really concentrating on Asia. I think, our feeling that we've got to sort of sort out change is predominantly in relation to Asia. But I think the other thing that I see as a very positive development, and it's part of the reason that I'm here, is that there is a view in the government that we've perhaps ignored our global role to too great a degree. And that's one reason why we've put such an emphasis on the G20 now. People have different views on the way the G20 is developed. But for us it's a plus, because it gives us a seat at a table which has the major role in talking about global economic changes. which we didn't have before, and that's a plus. And I know that's a situation which Argentina finds itself in as well, and you know, I wouldn't dream of thinking of commenting on your views towards it, but it seems to me it's a plus, because it's better to have a say in what's going on than not to have a say in what's going on. I think we're also trying to do more in terms of our bilateral relations with Latin America and also with Africa. And that's driven by self-interest, it's driven by largely economic perspectives, but I think with Latin America a bit more than that. I think with Latin America there is a view that there are areas of common interest where we can work together more. We haven't paid enough attention to it in the past. So I think that's another area where we're seeking to change. The topic tonight is on Asia, and I've tried to give you some sort of idea of the way we're thinking. Frankly, I can't give you the answers because I don't think anybody can give you the answers in Australia. I don't think we've done very well up until now, but at least we're thinking about the issues, and we're thinking about the issues very hard. I have to say, I'm not sure anybody else is doing it better. That's my only consolation. But let me just leave you with one last thought about Australian foreign policy, why it's a particular challenge, and I think a particularly interesting area, although I wish Australians would pay a bit more attention to it. And it's this. The countries of main priority for Australia are countries with historical backgrounds, languages and everything else totally different to our own. Australia, although it has become a far more multicultural country in the last generation, was until the middle of the last century essentially an Anglo-Celtic country. And it was surrounded by countries totally different from itself. Different languages, different religions, emerging from colonial periods for the most part. Very, very different. Now, if you look at, the Canadians always get slightly irritated when I tell them this, but it's always told in good faith. Look, you guys have very similar backgrounds in terms of systems and so on to our own. But, your priority is, after all, the United States, which is pretty similar. I know you don't think so, but it looks pretty similar to us. And Europe, and then, of course, Japan and China. Everybody is interested in Japan and China. Now, I just take an example here because I'm in Buenos Aires. If you look at country, of course, the United States is hugely important to you and is a priority for you. Europe, great historical importance. And you also have your reach into China and Japan. But nobody would doubt too much the countries of major foreign policy priority to you are and have been traditionally other Latin countries. What I'm saying is that for us, we have to deal with a group of countries which aren't akin to our own society. And that makes it quite difficult. You find from a lot of the time we get into areas of real friction, particularly with countries like Indonesia and China, partly because of the way our system and our society works. And that makes the issue of diplomacy in dealing with these countries quite different for us. I found during, for example, posting I had in Indonesia, you never knew at the beginning of one week what was going to happen at the end of the week. But a lot of the problems that came up were due to the fact that the way the Australian press reported on Indonesia, often quite outrageously, suggested that they were barbarians. And the way the Indonesians reported on Australians was that they were a group of people who were totally uneducated, who lacked sensitivity, who had no idea about how Asians thought, and were constantly talking down to them. So you had those issues to deal with really all the time. It exacerbated almost any question that came up. China, not quite the same, but societal differences, human rights issues, major problems to deal with. And Japan, well, Japan's Japan, it's unique, it's great. They, in a sense, have cultural difficulties. I say this to Japanese, so I'm not talking out of school. They have cultural difficulties with everybody, because everybody finds them so hard to deal with. In many ways, the society thinks like ours, but there are huge differences and difficulties with which one has to deal, because it is such a different society. Look, that's enough for me by way of introduction, I think. Thank you very much indeed for